Cattle die, kinsmen die, all men are mortal. Words of deeds shall never perish, nor a well-known name. The Have-em-all, verse 76. Death is perhaps the oldest certainty humanity has ever known. Long before written language, before cities or temples, our ancestors buried their dead and wondered what, if anything, remained after the final breath. Was there a soul that lingered, a spirit that watched over us all, or perhaps something less tangible, but no less real? A memory, a legacy, a story carried forward by those left behind. In every age and in every corner of the world, we've answered that question differently. Some imagined ancestors who walked beside them. Others feared restless spirits unable to find peace, while others believed that the dead watched over the living, or returned only to settle old debts. Regardless of the answer, one thing remained constant. Humanity has always refused to believe that death is simply the end. Tonight, we're going to explore why. Not merely whether ghosts exist, but why ghost stories have endured for thousands of years, why certain places feel haunted before we know their history, why grief can make us feel a loved one's presence long after they're gone, and why architecture, sound, memory, and expectation can convince us that we are not alone. And finally, why there will always be those willing to profit from our hope that death is not the final chapter. Because whether ghosts are real or not, they are an integral part of who we are and what we leave behind. Myths and legend, history and hysteria, religion and the far reaches of the occult. These and more are the children of a common thing, belief, an intrinsic part of what makes us human. I'm your host, Liam Blackwood, an independent scholar of esoterica and eccentricity, a rational skeptic, father of two, writer, and lover of life. Pull up a chair, fellow lamplighters, and let us cast the shadows back a bit as we examine what lies beneath the light of Occam's lantern. And welcome back to Occam's Lantern. Today we've got one that started as a bit of a filler episode, but became something much deeper as it developed. We've been having a bit of a heat wave lately, and I am not productive when the temperature reaches over 90. As such, not a lot of news on hand, nor listener mail, so we're going to jump right in where we started and settle in for the ride. Now, if you've spent any time with modern depictions of Norse mythology, you might have come away believing that every Viking dreamed only of Valhalla, that glorious hall where fallen warriors feast until Ragnarok. But the reality is far more fascinating. The Norse did not possess a single unified vision of the afterlife. Instead, death could take many roads. And while those who fell honorably in battle might indeed find themselves welcome into Odin's Hall of Valhalla, even then, tradition tells us only half of the slain were chosen. The other half, instead, going to Freya's fields, herself a deity associated not only with love and beauty, but also with war, magic, and death. Those who died of sickness or old age were often believed to travel to hell. Not the fiery realm popularized by later Christian imagery, but the domain of the goddess of the same name. Helheim was less a place of eternal punishment than a quiet land of the dead, reserved for those whose lives had simply reached their natural conclusion. Yet, the Norse understanding of death extended beyond destinations. They also believed that a person was not defined by a single soul. Old Norse literature speaks of several aspects that together made an individual, while the hammer, H-A-M-R, not the tool, was the shell, the physical body, the form. The hugr represented the mind or will. The Filgya often appeared as an animal in dreams or visions and was thought to accompany a person's fate. Then there was the Hamingya, a concept that always fascinated me. Hamingya is often translated as luck, but that barely scratches the surface. It was something more enduring. A person's fortune, strengths, reputation, and spiritual momentum woven together. A powerful Hamingya could elevate a family for generations. It could be inherited by descendants, bestowed upon allies, or diminished through dishonorable acts. Success in battle, prosperity in trade, even the respect one commanded within a community could all be seen as reflections of a strong Hamingya. In many ways, it resembles an invisible inheritance, not wealth, but fortune in a way. Not magic in the sense of casting spells, but an unseen current shaping the lives of those connected to it. Some scholars have even suggested that this belief helps explain why certain legendary weapons or heirlooms seem to possess extraordinary qualities. A sword passed down through generations was more than sharpened steel. It carried the victories, prestige, and Hamingya of those who wielded it before. It's a popular fantasy trope that may have its roots in this very concept. Cursed weapons and armor whose bearers always fall to misfortune, or mighty arms and armaments that bring its wielder glory. The object itself became inseparable from the stories surrounding it. Was the blade truly magical? Or did it embody the accumulated reputation and fortune of an entire lineage? Well, that question should sound familiar because throughout history, humanity has repeatedly attributed power to places, objects, and people that seem to carry echoes of those who came before. Sometimes we call them blessings or curses, but sometimes those echoes are known as ghosts. The Norse were hardly alone in imagining that something of us survives death. Thousands of miles away and centuries earlier, the ancient Egyptians developed one of history's most intricate understandings of the human soul. Rather than viewing a person as a single, indivisible spirit, they believed we were composed of multiple aspects. Among these were the Ka, a person's vital essence, which was thought to continue existing after death, and required offerings from the living. Alongside it was the Ba, often depicted as a bird with a human head, representing personality and individuality, capable of traveling between the worlds of the living and dead. Death to the Egyptians was not an ending so much as a transformation, requiring preparation, remembrance, and care. The peoples of Mesopotamia imagined a quieter fate. Their dead journeyed to a vast underworld known as the House of Dust, where all souls, great and small alike, existed as pale shades. Yet, even there, the relationship between the living and the dead remains important. Spirits who were forgotten, improperly buried, or denied funerary rites were believed capable of troubling the living, an idea that would echo throughout centuries of cultures to come. The Greeks, too, envisioned shades crossing into another realm. Ferried across the river Styx by Charon, the dead entered Hades, where heroes, kings, and common folk alike continued in diminished form. Yet Greek mythology is filled with spirits who refused that journey. Restless souls driven by vengeance, unfinished business, or improper burial. Time and again, the lesson was the same. The dead deserved remembrance, and neglect carried consequence. Across the world in Japan, folklore gave rise to the yurei, spirits often depicted with white burial robes, lingering because powerful emotions bound them to the world of the living. Love, hatred, betrayal, grief, and revenge could all tether a soul long after death. Unlike many Western ghost stories, the yurei were not simply frightening apparitions. They were tragic figures, reminders of unresolved emotions that can outlive the people who carried them. Even the traditions that embraced ancestor veneration often blurred the line between memory and presence. In China, families maintained ancestral tablets and made offerings to those who had passed. Across much of Africa, ancestors were viewed not as distant relics of history, but as continuing members of the family whose guidance and protection remained an active part of daily life. In Mesoamerica, traditions honoring the dead eventually evolved into celebrations like Dia de los Muertos, whose remembrance became not an act of fear, but one of joyful reunion. Every culture tells these stories differently. The names change, the rituals as well. The landscape of the afterlife shift from frozen halls to sunset fields and shadowy underworlds to peaceful ancestral homes. But beneath those differences lies a remarkable constant. Human beings have rarely been content to believe that death is simply the end. The question then is not why one culture believed in ghosts, but why almost all of them did. So, why ghosts? It's a question that's followed us as long as we've been burying our dead. Different cultures gave different answers, sure, but they were all wrestling with the same impossible thing. How do you accept that someone who was a part of your everyday life is simply gone? We spend years building habits around the people we love. We expect to hear their voice when the phone rings. We know exactly where they'll be sitting at Thanksgiving dinner. We can picture the look on their face long before they even speak. Those little expectations become part of the rhythm of our lives, and one day that rhythm breaks. The chair is still there, the coat hanging by the door. You catch yourself reaching for your phone because something funny happened, and just for a split second you forget before it all comes rushing back. If you've ever lost anybody close, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's surprisingly common for people in mourning to hear familial footsteps, catch the scent of a loved one's perfume or cigarette smoke, or think they spotted them in a crowd before realizing it was someone else. Parents sometimes report hearing their child's laughter, while widows and widowers describe feeling someone sitting beside them on the bed. These experiences are so widespread that psychologists generally don't consider them signs of mental illness at all. They're a normal part of grieving. Our brains don't update overnight. Years of memory and expectations don't vanish just because reality has changed. They linger, quietly insisting that the person we loved for decades ought to walk through the front door at any moment. It's, forgive the wording, hauntingly beautiful. It means our minds aren't just filing away information like a computer. They're holding on to relationships that mattered. Love leaves an imprint, and that imprint doesn't simply disappear the moment someone's heart stops beating. When you look at ghost stories through that lens, they become something more than campfire tales. They are expressions of all of our strongest emotions: grief, guilt, hope, even fear of what that person could be experiencing, or why we are experiencing the things we are. Sometimes they're about justice. Someone murdered, someone forgotten, someone denied a proper burial. But there are times they're simply about love refusing to let go. The ghosts aren't there to frighten us, usually. They're there because, emotionally, the story feels unfinished. Maybe that's why so many hauntings happen in homes rather than battlefields. Home is where birthdays happened, where each of our festive mornings happened, where children took their first steps, and if any place is going to feel like it still echoes the people who lived there, it's the place where their lives unfolded. Whether those echoes are spiritual, psychological, or something else entirely, what's important to understand is that underneath the spooky tales, the undead antagonists of video and tabletop games, or the dread in an abandoned location. Now, underneath all of that, there were memories, stories of what came before. Memories that we cling to for reasons anyone with a shred of empathy can understand. But grief alone can't explain everything. After all, ghost stories aren't confined to those who have recently lost a loved one. Reports come from every corner of the globe, every culture, every generation. Ordinary people, otherwise rational people, have walked away, convinced they saw something they couldn't explain. Now, does that mean that every haunted house has a ghost lurking in the attic? Probably not. But neither can we simply wave away millions of experiences by declaring everyone involved was lying, gullible, or insane. Frankly, I believe that answer is just as intellectually lazy as accepting every ghost story at face value. So let's approach it from a different angle. What if the experiences themselves were genuine, but our explanations for them weren't always correct? The human brain is an extraordinary machine. It builds models of the world from incomplete information, filling in gaps so quickly that we rarely notice it's happening. Most of the time, that ability serves us remarkably well, though other times, our filling in of the gaps leads to conclusions that might feel frighteningly real, but are actually something quite mundane or, in fact, nothing at all. And when you combined expectation with emotion, unfamiliar environments, strange acoustics, poor lighting, and a brain evolved to detect threats before certainty, well, you have all the ingredients for a haunting. As stated before, the remarkable thing about the human brain isn't that it passively observes the world, it actively predicts it. At any given moment, your senses are feeding your brain an overwhelming amount of information. Every sound, every flicker of light, every scent, every shift in temperature, your conscious mind has to process it. At any given moment, your senses are feeding your brain an overwhelming amount of information. Every sound, every flicker of light, every scent, shift in temperature. If you had to process every bit of it individually, you'd be getting nothing done. So your brain acts like an editor, filtering, organizing, and making educated guesses. And as I previously stated, those guesses are often astonishingly accurate. But when they aren't, they're fanciful reconstructions from absolutely nothing tangible. Take a simple example. We've all looked up at the clouds and seen dragons, faces, or sailing ships, stared at the front of a car and noticed a smile. Maybe even in the middle of the night, a coat hanging on the wall for a heartbeat. Is that someone standing there? The effect is called pareidolia, our tendency to perceive familiar patterns where none intentionally exist. And from an evolutionary standpoint, it's a feature, not a bug. Imagine our ancestors walking through tall grass hundreds, thousands of years ago. One hears a rustle. Is it just the wind, or is it a predator lying in wait? The person who assumed it's probably nothing and guessed wrong didn't tend to pass their genes along. The one who occasionally mistook the wind for a lion survived to have children. Our brains evolved to err on the side of caution because it's better to see one face that isn't there than to miss the one that is. That instinct never left us. Today it shows up in grainy security footage, blurred photographs, electronic voice phenomenon, and those countless stories of shadows standing just outside the bedroom door. When someone tells you there's a face in that window, it's almost impossible not to see it yourself. Your brain has been given a pattern and now eagerly completes the picture. None of this means that people are lying, quite the opposite, in fact. When someone says they genuinely saw a face staring back at them from the darkness, I believe they experienced exactly that. The question isn't whether the experience was real. The question is what created it. And, as we'll soon see, our brains don't just fill in missing visual information. Under the right circumstances, they can convince us that someone is standing in the room with us. In fact, look behind you. See? So, if Periidola explains why we sometimes see things, what accounts for the actual encounters, feelings, and experiences that go beyond the scope of basic sensory fabrication? Sleep paralysis is one of the many phenomena that may explain why so many people are convinced they've actually encountered something. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night. Your eyes open, you can see your bedroom, recognize furniture, the light filtering in through the curtains, maybe even the glow of a digital clock across the room. Everything seems normal, at least until you try to move and nothing happens. Your arms won't respond. Your legs feel as if they're made of stone. Even speaking is impossible. You try to scream, but nothing happens. You know you're awake, but your body refuses to obey. And then comes the worst part. You realize you're not alone. Maybe it's a figure standing in the corner of the room, or a feeling of some entity setting on your chest, making it difficult to breathe. Sometimes it's nothing more than the overwhelming certainty that another presence is watching you. Maybe a woman in white at the edge of your bed. You've heard of those before. Sleep paralysis occurs when the brain awakens before the body is finished emerging from REM sleep. During dreaming, our muscles are intentionally switched off by the brainstem to keep us from acting out our dreams. Occasionally, that switch lingers for a few terrifying moments after consciousness returns. The result is a strange overlap between waking reality and the dreaming mind. You are awake enough to perceive your surroundings, but still deep enough into dreaming for those phantasms of the mind to spill into the room around you. What's truly fascinating is how universal these experiences are. In Newfoundland, people once blamed the old hag, a witch-like figure said to set upon the sleeper's chest. In Japan, the experience is known as kaneshibari, often attributed to folklore, to spirits, or supernatural restraints. Throughout Europe, tales of incubi and succubi describe shadowy visitors who arrive in the night, pressing upon the body and stealing breath. This was perhaps captured most masterfully in Henry Fuseli's famous painting, The Nightmare, wherein a grotesque demonic form crouches upon the chest of a distraught sleeping maiden, a spectral, glowing-eyed mare's head watching everything. The painting connected with so many that many would call it pop art, perhaps the first example of it. It was done in numerous iterations, copied by many and flocked to by audiences far and wide, all in the year 1781. Across cultures separated by oceans and centuries, people described remarkably similar encounters long before neuroscience offered an explanation. The experiences were real, as was the terror. The only thing that changed between cultures was the name it was granted. Of course, not every ghost story begins in the familiar footfalls of our bedroom or private domicile. Some seem tied to places old, unfamiliar, and abandoned by life in general. The abandoned asylum at the edge of town, crumbling Victorian manors, old prisons, forgotten battlefields, liminal spaces such as a castle that's watched centuries of bloodshed unfold beneath its walls, but is now echoing in silence. You've probably experienced something similar yourself, walking into a building and something feels off. You can't quite explain it. Maybe it's the silence or the smell of old wood and damp stone. Maybe it's the way your footsteps echo just a little longer than they should, or it could merely be the weight of history pressing down on your imagination. Whatever the cause, the sensation is real. It is something I and many others find deeply fascinating, and the basic idea is simple. Environment shapes perception. Human beings are profoundly influenced by the spaces they inhabit, often without realizing it. Think about how differently you behave in a cathedral compared to a shopping mall, or inside a courtroom compared to standing beneath the towering trees of a forest. The architecture changes your behavior before you've consciously decided to act differently. We become more reflexive and sometimes more anxious. Architects understood this. Whether it's casinos, museums, churches, or even theme parks, each of them is carefully designed to guide your emotional state. Lighting directs your attention, long hallways create anticipation, high ceilings inspire awe, and narrow corridors build tension. Echoes make a room feel larger than it is, while deep shadows encourage the mind to imagine what lies just beyond sight. Of course, none of this is supernatural. It's simply how human beings interact with the environments we create. Now imagine taking all of those elements and combining them. An ancient castle with poor lighting, centuries of tragic history, unfamiliar noises, visitors who've been told the place is haunted, and, well, before anyone reports seeing a ghost, the stage has already been set. It doesn't mean that the people there are pretending. Far from it. It simply means that perception doesn't happen in a vacuum. We're constantly interpreting the world through the lens of our expectations, emotions, and surroundings. And old buildings have a remarkable way of giving our imaginations plenty to work with. It can sometimes even be so subtle we couldn't consciously register it if we tried. Anton LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan in 1966, was often brought in as a specialist in bizarre cases and found that more often than not, almost all of these locations in which strange occurrences took place, there were odd measurements, off angles, and other architectural errors unperceivable to the naked eye, yet still easily measured. The simplest measurement would be to take a pendulum, rope or chain with a heavy weight, and press it to the top of a wall. On one wall, the pendulum would hang straight down, resting against it, whilst on the other, it would dangle free, sometimes an inch or more away from the wall. Prolonged exposure to these off conditions seemed to have an impact on the mind of those who were around them for a long time. Another fascinating example by LaVey was the law of the trapezoid, something I will cover in more depth in a later episode, I'm sure. But the simplest summary is this. LaVey viewed the trapezoid as a frustrated pyramid, if you will, as it was, in fact, a triangle with the top lopped off. He argued this incompleteness registered on an unconscious level as unsettling, creating a solid mass that subconsciously bothers the viewer because something is missing. He theorized that sharp, obtuse angles and trapezoidal geometry inherently radiate a sort of magical energy. For individuals not attuned to these forces, the shapes cause distress, and to a practicing Satanist, they act as a conduit for heightened power and focus. Notable examples of this comes in everything from the stereotypical gabled roofs of haunted houses to the Empire's iconography in Star Wars, especially the Emperor's throne. What shape was that again? Now, to properly jump into our next bit, a quick ghost story, one you might be familiar with. In the early 1980s, an engineer named Vic Tandy was working late one evening in the laboratory of a medical equipment manufacturer in England. By all accounts, it was an ordinary building, if not for the fact that people did not like being there after dark. Employees spoke in hushed voices about an uncomfortable feeling that settled over the laboratory once the sun went down. Some described it as an overwhelming sense of dread, while others claimed they felt as though someone was standing just behind them, watching from the edge of the room. The stories spread, and before long, the building had earned a reputation. It was haunted. Tandy wasn't particularly interested in ghost stories, as he was an engineer, and like most engineers, he preferred problems that could be measured. Until one evening, while working alone late one night, it came. He felt it himself. The room seemed strangely oppressive, the air heavy. Every instinct told him that he wasn't alone. And out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement. A gray shape, vaguely human, standing just inside the laboratory. He turned towards it, and it vanished. Now, that would be enough to convince many people they'd just seen a ghost, and while unsettled, Vic was curious. However, the breakthrough of his examination came almost by accident. While preparing for a fencing match, he noticed that the blade of one of his foils, clamped securely in a vise, was vibrating all by itself. There was no one touching it, no obvious source of movement, just a thin steel blade trembling in the air. Curious, he began investigating. The culprit turned out to be a newly installed extractor fan. It was producing a standing wave of infrasound, sound at a frequency so low that human ears generally cannot hear it. Though inaudible, these low-frequency vibrations can still affect the body. They can create feelings of unease, pressure in the chest, nausea, and, under the right conditions, even subtle disturbances in vision. Later analysis suggested the frequency in that laboratory was around 19 hertz, close enough to the natural resonance of the human eyeball that it may have contributed to the fleeting gray figure Tandy believed he saw in his peripheral vision. When the fan was modified, the hauntings stopped. Call it an industrial exorcism, if you will. No priest necessary, just an engineer with a curious mind and a willingness to ask one simple question. What else could explain this? Now, does that mean that every ghost has an extractor fan hiding behind it? Of course not. But it does remind us of something important. Because sometimes the difference between a haunting and a scientific discovery is nothing more than the decision to keep investigating. Vic Tandy's experience demonstrates something that I think often gets overlooked when we talk about hauntings. Sometimes the environment is affecting us in ways we never consciously recognize. We tend to imagine perception as a camera, faithfully recording whatever happens around us, but it doesn't really work that way. Our brains, as I've stated twice now, have been constantly taking shortcuts, making predictions, and trying to answer the simple question of, is this place safe? Long before we've consciously decided we're uncomfortable, our bodies have already begun collecting clues. That becomes especially interesting when you consider the kind of places that earned reputations for being haunted. It's rarely new office buildings or freshly constructed homes. More often, they're old castles, abandoned hospitals, or other liminal spaces that people have abandoned but have been standing for generations. They creak as the temperature changes. Air moves between hidden gaps in the walls. Pipes expand and contract. The stone itself carries sound in a strange way, and unfamiliar acoustics can make it surprisingly difficult to tell where a noise actually came from. Spend enough time in a building like that after dark, and it's easy to understand why your imagination begins filling in the blanks. There are even more subtle influences at work at times. Carbon monoxide, for example, has quietly solved more than a few hauntings. Because it's colorless and odorless, people often have no idea they're being exposed until symptoms begin to appear. Headaches, dizziness, anxiety, confusion, even visual hallucinations have all been documented in cases of prolonged exposure. Several famous ghost stories have come to remarkably anticlimactic conclusions when someone finally thought to inspect the furnace instead of calling a paranormal investigator. Poor air quality in general can have similar effects. Certain molds are known to cause fatigue and cognitive problems, particularly in old buildings where moisture has had decades to seep into walls and floorboards. Even something as mundane as dehydration, exhaustion, or spending hours wandering through a dimly lit structure can make the brain more prone to mistakes. None of these factors guarantees that someone will see a ghost, but each one nudges perception just a little further from certainty. And that's really the theme running through all of these examples. The environment doesn't have to create a hallucination out of thin air. It only has to make us slightly less confident in what we're experiencing. Once uncertainty enters the picture, the mind starts doing what it's always done, connecting dots, searching for patterns, and constructing the story that best explains the feeling in the pit of our stomachs. If you've ever left an old building thinking there was something strange about that place, you may have been exactly right. The building was strange. It simply may have been strange in a way that had more to do with physics, biology, and architecture rather than anything supernatural. Have you ever noticed how people discover a building is haunted after they've had an experience? No, more often than not, they know the reputation before they've ever stepped inside. Oh, this prison housed hundreds of executions. 3 guests died in room 214. And by the time the tour guide unlocks the front door, the story has already begun. Now, that isn't meant as a criticism of ghost tours. Quite the opposite. I genuinely enjoy them. They preserve local history, keep historical buildings standing, and, in most cases, generate the revenue needed to maintain places that might otherwise fall into ruin. Without the allure of the supernatural, a great many old mansions, castles, and battlefields would simply become expensive restoration projects with very few visitors. The ghost story is often what keeps the lights on. Stories, as we have covered many times here on the channel, have power. The moment we're given a narrative, our brains begin looking for evidence that supports it. It's the same reason a horror movie soundtrack can make an empty hallway feel threatening, or why reading a ghost story before bed makes every creak in the house seem suddenly significant. The information we receive changes the way we interpret what follows. Psychologists call this priming. Simply exposing someone to an idea can influence how they perceive later experiences. If, for instance, I tell you a bottle of wine costs $200, many people would report that it tastes richer and more complex than the exact same wine poured from a cheaper bottle. If I tell you a medicine is exceptionally effective, there's a good chance it'll work better, even if it's chemically identical. The placebo effect is another good example of this. Our expectations shape our experience in ways that are both subtle and surprisingly powerful. The same thing happens in supposedly haunted locations. Under ordinary circumstances, you'd probably dismiss a floorboard creak or heating pipe knocking somewhere as just what it is without a second thought. But while you're in a building that you've been told is haunted by the ghost of a murdered nobleman, sometimes those same sensations become pieces of a much larger puzzle. The story provides the framework, and your mind begins fitting each new experience neatly into it. This is one of the reasons I find LaVey's law of the trapezoid to be so interesting. Whether or not you accept his terminology, the central observation has genuine merit. Environments are designed to influence us. Architecture isn't neutral, neither is lighting or sound. The atmosphere of a place changes the way we think and feel long before we consciously recognize it's happening. So, if you leave a supposedly haunted locale feeling like you experienced something extraordinary, well, I'm not surprised in the slightest. One thing I'd like to make clear before we delve any further is that there's an important distinction between symbolism and deception. Throughout this podcast, I've spoken favorably of things like ritual, mythology, tarot, even Jung's fascination with symbols and archetypes, I believe, fits in here. I don't believe these things are valuable because they possess some mystical ability to predict the future. I think they're valuable because they encourage us to ask questions we might not otherwise ask ourselves. Think of a tarot reading. If someone lays out a card representing loss, change, or opportunity, the card itself hasn't revealed some hidden truth, but it may encourage you to reflect on your relationships, your ambitions, your fears, or choices you've been avoiding. In that sense, the cards become less like fortune-telling and more like a structured conversation with yourself. And I believe that there is a very real value in that. The problem begins when someone claims those symbols grant them privileged access to objective truth. When they insist they know exactly what your future holds. When they tell grieving parents they can speak to their dead children for a fee or exposure. At that point, we've crossed a line. Not from skepticism into belief, but from honest exploration into exploitation. History is full of people who have made fortunes selling certainty to those who could least afford to question it. The 19th century spiritualist movement was built on seances, spirit rappings, floating tables, and mysterious manifestations that often collapsed the moment a careful investigation took place. In fact, Harry Houdini spent the final years of his life exposing fraudulent mediums, not because he wanted to rob people of hope, but because he'd watched too many grieving families manipulated by performers who understood one thing exceptionally well. Grief makes us vulnerable. When you've lost someone, you'll cling to almost anything that promises one more conversation, one more apology, one more chance to hear a familiar voice. It's one of the most profound human desires imaginable, and also one of the easiest to exploit. The techniques themselves aren't especially mysterious. Professional mentalists have been demonstrating them honestly for decades. They call them cold reading, hot reading, shotgunning, and the Barnum effect. Observations about human psychology. Methods of encouraging people to supply the very information they believe they're receiving. You watch a stage mentalist and you'll often hear them explain exactly what they're doing. They'll tell you it's an illusion, a performance built on careful observation and suggestion. The audience applauds because the skill is genuine, even if the supernatural claims are not. A fraudulent medium does something very different. They wrap those same techniques in the language of certainty. They claim the performance is real. They invoke the authority of the dead and often ask people to suspend the very skepticism that might protect them. It isn't spiritual guidance, it's a confidence game. People like John Edward and Sylvia Browne built enormously successful careers around the appearance of impossible knowledge. Their readings often relied on familiar techniques, broad statements, carefully phrased questions, selective attention, and their remarkable ability to let the audience do most of the work for themselves. When the hits landed, they were celebrated as miracles, and when they missed, the misses were forgotten, explained away, or quietly edited out of television broadcasts. The tragedy isn't simply that these methods can fool people, it's who they tend to fool. The recently widowed, parents who've buried children, people who are desperate for answers after a tragedy. Those aren't marks to be admired for their gullibility. They're human beings trying to navigate unbearable loss. Now, I'm all for putting a rube out of his money, but not in this circumstance, not in dealing with so profound a human experience. If your livelihood depends on convincing someone you've spoken to that their deceased spouse, child, or parent is available through conduit for a low, low price, then you've accepted an extraordinary ethical responsibility, and if you cannot actually do what you claim, you're not offering comfort. You're selling hope under false pretenses, and to me, that is one of the cruelest forms of fraud imaginable. Don't get me started on Ed and Lorraine Warren. That'll be its own little episode diving deeper into these leeches. So, after all of that, where does it leave us? We've looked through ancient civilizations and their visions of the afterlife. We've looked at the psychology of grief, the strange ways our minds construct reality, and the environmental factors that can make an ordinary building feel anything but. We've also seen that some people have taken one of humanity's oldest questions and turned it into a business model, profiting from sorrow while offering certainty. But I don't think any of that diminishes the importance of ghost stories. If anything, it makes them more fascinating. Because even if an apparition had an explanation, we'd still be left with a remarkable truth. Every culture, separated by oceans and centuries, has wrestled with this question. And science can tell us a great deal about how we experience the world. It can explain why we see these patterns. What science cannot do is tell us how to grieve, or how to remember. It doesn't tell us what a father feels when he catches himself dialing the number of a son who's been gone for years, or why an old house can suddenly feel full of people who've long since passed away. Those belong to the human experience. And perhaps that's why ghost stories have survived for thousands of years. Not because they're all literally true, nor because every strange sound has a hidden cause, but because they're stories about absence, about love, regret, justice, a refusal to believe that a life can simply vanish without leaving a trace behind. Whether that trace is a soul, a memory, a legacy, or simply the lives we've touched while we're here, I'll leave that for you to decide. What I do know is this. Long after we're gone, the stories people will tell about us will continue shaping the world we left behind, and just maybe that's enough to make every one of us haunt the future in our own way. So, yeah. That one went a bit harder than I expected it to when I started off, in a good way. I've been having a lot of reflection in the summer heat and recently had a bit of self-revelation towards the end of writing this. It's a new podcast, there's not a very big crowd at the moment, and success as a venture in this line is an extreme rarity. I've been getting caught up in trying to win lately and been increasingly disappointed at each and every endeavor ending in a flop. But this one has felt different. As much as I would love for it to succeed, I'm not going to stop just because it doesn't. I'm doing this as a way to leave something behind. I don't want to disappear into the void or be a shadow in old pictures. I'm going to be a voice to be heard, an idea to be shared, thoughts to be challenged. That's the goal. That's my ghost. And that being said, I think it's time to step out from the dusty mansion, take our top hats off and greatcoats, pour a glass of something refreshing, and set ourselves comfortably in the air-conditioned paradise of the decompression chamber. And hopefully that air conditioner doesn't have a screwy fan that makes us see Casper. Now, personally, I've sadly never had a ghost experience. Never experienced anything paranormal in my life, aside from creepy places and feelings of, nope, shouldn't be here. I had nightmares a lot as a child and learned to control my dreams into a lucid type state from repeated practice. As such, usually my cases of sleep paralysis lead to me falling back into a dream state and actively deciding what kind of dream to have. That's always been cool, but no, never seen the Hat Man or the Benadryl spiders. I did have an encounter with a vampire in my high school angst-driven years, but that was during a controlled bout of sleep paralysis. So, without any personal stories to draw from, I'm going to have to delve into modern media. What's your favorite ghost movie? Or hell, game at that. Sound off in the comments. Or let me, know via PM. Fatal Frame has been an interesting Japanese horror series where your main weapon is a camera that you use to take pictures of ghosts, each picture doing a sort of damage to them until you defeat them. There's much more to it, of course, but that concept was what really made the game click with me. Would Silent Hill count? I'm not too sure on that one. Ooh, I've got a great one. Sega Genesis, a game literally called just called Haunting, starring Poltergeist, a green-colored punk rock skater who was offed by accident by a stereotypical rich, corrupt family. I think they gave him a bad Italian name like Sarduni or something, Guido. Who knows? I can't remember. It was pretty heavy-handed, but each stage you're controlling this vengeful leather jacket specter using the furniture, household objects, and environment itself to build up a fear meter by possessing them, making them do all kinds of funny and cool stuff, until the family got so scared that they moved into a new house, and you'd follow them. It gets really off the rails at the end, as I think any Sega game did then. Ends up the family dog is some alien entity or something. I can't remember. I always boot it up every now and then for nostalgia's sake. My daughter got a real kick out of it. Instead of health, you'd have ectoplasm that went down whenever you haunted anything, and you'd have to return to the underworld and scrounge up more before you continued. It's one of those games I really wish would get a revisit. Movies. Oh boy. I mean, obviously everyone's first guess is going to be the Patrick Swayze Ghost romantic take on the afterlife that plucks at everyone's heartstrings and was probably responsible for a bit of a boom in those aforementioned grief hucksters. The power of seeing the lost loved one last time became a recurring Hollywood motif to this day. My pick, right off the bat, off the top of my head, is either going to be the dry as hell and not very good movie in general, but super impressive, very good, even holding up way beyond this day. It was a practical effects heavy movie work. Fred Astaire was in it. I remember that. It was 1981, just called Ghost Story. And again, the framing device and everything was kind of lame, but the effects of the ghost when she shows up, superb. I would put them right up there with the practical effects from The Thing, and that's saying a lot. The equally not really a good movie, but way more fun, 13 Ghosts remake from 2001. Matthew Lillard is bae, always a treat. Ghost Ship, if nothing for its over-the-top gory intro that'll always live as an all-time classic of the genre. Sixth Sense, the others, Ghostbusters, of course. Personally, I'm not a fan of the James Wan flicks, even disregarding my brutal hatred of the Warrens, but I mean, to each their own. I can see their appeal, especially in modern media, and the type of people who like that sort of movie. I want to keep it brief. It was a rather long episode to begin with, so whether ghosts exist or not, stories certainly do. Every family has one, every town has one, every building. It's because stories are the closest thing we have to immortality. long after we're gone, they'll still be wandering around, finding new ears to haunt. And that about covers it for today's episode. I want to thank you all for tuning in, sharing the podcast with others, and offering your thoughts and insight. I appreciate every bit of energy spent towards keeping this ghost afloat. If you have any particular tales, topics you'd like to see covered, or anything else, you can reach out to me on Facebook, YouTube, or via email at liamlykos@zohomail.com. That's LIAMLYKOS at ZOHOMAIL.com. Our next episode, I'll be reading some of my own writings, and we will be pondering the idea of aeons, the age of existence separated into marked epochs. Are we on the cusp of a new one? This will lead into our next proper dive in episode 10, as we take a look at Doomsday, the apocalypse, the end of the world as we know it. Why do we always seem to think it's just around the corner? That and more, but until next time, keep the fire stoked and the lanterns full. This has been Liam Blackwood, and you've been listening to Occam's Lantern.